Welcome. This video is meant to complement the video on consumer demand theory. In that particular video, we did not consider welfare impacts. In this video, we will look at some of the welfare impacts and how economists measure welfare as areas underneath demand curves. I know that in the earlier video we talked about consumer surplus, but consumer surplus is only one of a number of different methods or different measures that we have of well-being or welfare. One of the important things about this video is that it deals with environmental economics. In other words, what happens with and how do we develop demand curves in the case of environmental goods that are not traded in markets. When we measure consumer welfare, the topic gets rather complicated. But there is an excellent discussion of what follows in chapter 2 of my book with Erwin Bilta entitled The Economics of Nature, and it's available at www.vankooten.net if you look near the bottom of that particular front page. A less technical discussion of non-market valuation in the context of project evaluation can be found in chapter 3 of another book, a more recent one from 2021 entitled Applied Welfare Economics Trade and Agricultural Policy Analysis, that is available from University of Toronto Press. Now, what we're interested in is compensated demand functions such as the Hicksian demand or the compensated demand function, which we examined along with the ordinary demand function in the Theory of Consumer Demand lecture. However, there, as I noted earlier, we only investigated consumer surplus, which in this particular lecture we denote with S. And we looked at that as an area under the demand function and above the market price. But notice that we defined the demand function in this case as a marginal willingness to pay function as opposed to a demand function derived by maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. Likewise, in the Theory of the Firm lecture, we identified quasi-rent, which is commonly referred to as producer surplus, and I use these terms somewhat interchangeably. And we defined that as an area above marginal cost or above the supply function and below the market price. Now, when it comes to quasi-rent or producer surplus, we know that that's grounded in the theory of the firm and cost theory. There, the producer surplus refers to actual changes in welfare that are based on actual output, costs to produce that output, and the revenues that underlie the marginal cost or supply function. The derivation of the demand function requires utility theory, and there are different measures of consumer welfare that are associated when we discuss the measure of utility. However, by considering the demand function as a marginal willing to pay function that slopes downward, as we saw earlier, we can define consumer surplus simply as total willingness to pay, if you like. Now, when we come to the compensating demand functions, we have 4 additional welfare measures which are based on this idea of compensation. And these depend on the property rights. That is, they depend on whether you have the right to the original situation that you're in as opposed to some new situation. We denote the original situation by a 0 and the new situation by 1. Well, the 4 measures that we then have are, first off, the compensating variation, which is defined as a move from situation 0 to situation 1. The compensating variation is the compensation to be provided or the amount of income to be taken away, which will leave the individual as well off in the new situation as she is in the old one. The reference level of utility is that of situation 0. In other words, the U sub 0 is what we use to denote that situation, the original one. The equivalent variation, on the other hand, from moving from 0 to 1 is the minimum compensation an individual is willing to receive, or the maximum amount she's willing to pay to forego a move from the initial to the final situation. In this case, the reference level of utility is U1, and that's the final situation. Then we also come to two other measures which rely on the fact that we don't have prices. So the compensating surplus is the compensating payment or offsetting income change that makes a person indifferent between the original situation and the opportunity to purchase the new quantity of the good whose price has changed, so situation 1. Now notice that we use CS to denote compensating surplus, which is why we use an S to denote regular consumer surplus. The equivalent surplus, on the other hand, is the income change required to keep the person consuming the old quantity of the good whose price has changed so that the consumer is indifferent, notice, indifferent to the new situation. So that means that they had the right to that new situation. So instead of permitting individuals to move along their indifference curves, adjusting to the new prices, compensating surplus and equivalent surplus require that an individual consume the new bundle or the old bundle respectfully. Notice that we're talking this way because there are no prices involved. So the compensating surplus and equivalent surplus do not require reference to price changes, as this is the case of environmental goods or services. Now we're going to explain this in greater detail in the next slides, but note the symmetry in the definitions, and we'll see that a little bit in the little bit of mathematics that we're going to use. So here we have a complicated diagram where what we have here is an original price line, and we have it here as well. And what we're assuming is that there's a policy that does two things. First, it reduces the price. So price reduction implies that that line, because remember in our earlier lecture, Q1 is the price that we're looking at, and Qn is the numeraire price. So the slope of such a line, like P0, is the negative, of course, of the price P1 divided by Q, the price of Qn. Qn is 1. So then we can just say that P0 is the price of P1, and we just assume that that P0 is negative, is interpreted to be negative so that we get a downward slope. So as the price is reduced, the slope will swing in this direction. In other words, it will become flatter. So in this case, we have P1, which is flatter, is a lower price than P0. So what we're assuming here is that this is the original situation where we have an income of M0, a budget constraint of M0. We have this price of P1, of good one, pardon me, and an equilibrium at 0. Now, we're proposing a policy that does two things. One, it increases the income from M0 to M1, and it reduces the price from the higher price P0 to the lower price P1. So this is our P1 price line. This is our budget constraint under P1, given that we have a budget M1. So we're going to have this jump from 0 to 1. All right. So how does that work? What happens? So let me just be clear. M's refer to the amount of budget that the person has. So we're increasing that budget from M0 to M1. The E refers to expenditure. So this would be the expenditure, EK, to get to K. ER would be the expenditure to get to R under these prices. And EH, pardon me, is going to be this point here. And this is the original prices. So this is the expenditure to get to the utility indifference curve U1, and at this price P0. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's first consider the change in budget and a reduction in price from P0 to P1. So the consumer can move from point 0 to point 1. If the consumer is at point 0 and has a right to 0, then what we do is we can calculate the compensating variation of the policy, and that is given by M1 minus EK, this difference here. Let me just get that from M1 to EK, where EK represents the minimum expenditure required to attain utility level U0 at this point K, so at the new set of prices. So in other words, the consumer is looking at U0. U0 is their original property right, and it's the difference between being on U0 at P1 versus being on U1 at P1, and that difference would be the compensating variation. In other words, this would be the amount that the consumer should be willing to pay to go from 0 to 1. Now the equivalent variation is measured by EH minus M0, and it represents the minimum expenditure required to achieve U1 at the old set of prices. So in this case, the consumer has a right to this utility level U1, this indifference curve, and with the old price they were at H. Now with the new price they are at P1, so the difference here is based on that old price, and it's equal to EH minus M0. Now suppose that the prices rise to P2, so now this red dotted line represents the higher price, where that price is not only higher than P1, but it's also higher than P0. But we assume that income is also raised to enable the consumer to still move to U1. So we're assuming a consumer has the right to be on 0, the price has now gone up, but the income has also gone up, remember. The compensating variation in this case is measured by the move from 0 to 2. So at 0 we had that income M0, at 2 we have, to be able to stay on U1 or to get to U1, we have M2, so therefore the compensating variation of the move from 0 to 2 is equal to M2 minus ER, which is not the same. Remember, we had the move when the price was P1 equal to M1 minus EK. So these two measures are not identical. So while the two compensating variation measures should be identical, this is not the case. You can look at the economics of nature for technical details on this, but basically it implies that compensating variation here is somewhat inconsistent. Now we can provide a simpler explanation of what's going on. So here what we have is we have the Marshallian or ordinary demand function. Notice that it's a function of price, so movement along the demand function occurs as prices change, but it's also a function of M. So if we change the budget, then there'd be a shift in this function. On the other hand, we have two compensated demand functions or Hicksian demand functions, one based on utility level 0 and the other on the indifference curve, which we denoted U1. So what that means is that yes, as price changes, you move along one of these demand functions, but if the utility changes, you move the demand function to the right or to the left. And we saw that when we looked at the indifference curves. Remember that if we changed the price of a good, then that enabled the consumer to go to a higher or a lower level of utility. So now we know that the consumer surplus is the area underneath the ordinary demand function. So in this case, we have the consumer surplus is A plus B. and that's not going to change except, well, it's not going to change, period. Now, suppose the price drops, so the individual has a right to U0, so they have the right to this. Then the compensating variation, so the amount that the individual would be willing to pay for that price drop, is given by area A. If the individual has a right to U1, then the equivalent variation, so this second measure of welfare, is given by A plus B plus C. And we note that the compensating variation is less than the consumer surplus, and that in turn is less than or equal to the equivalent variation. So again, note that the consumer surplus stays where it is. Suppose the price increases, however. So let's say that we were originally at P1, and now that the price has increased to P0. So in that case, the individual has the right to the original situation, that is this one here. Notice that it's now U1 and not U0. So the compensating variation is given by the area under this curve, which is the original demand function. So the compensating variation is A plus B plus C. If the individual has the right only to the new situation, so now U0 becomes our final situation. So this is the new situation now, the Q1 compensated demand function as a function of U0. Then the equivalent variation in this case is only A. So in this case, we have that the compensating variation is greater than or equal to the consumer surplus, greater than or equal to the equivalent variation. Again, the consumer surplus remains unchanged. Notice the importance here that the compensating variation of a price drop is equal to the negative of the equivalent variation of a price increase. And if you looked at it from the opposite point of view, you'd find that the compensating variation of a price increase would equal the negative of the equivalent variation of a price decrease. So now, consider the case of a change in environmental or an ecological good or service, and we've just used polar bears as an example here. Notice three things. First, the indifference curves must intersect this horizontal vertical axis. All right, the reason for that is you need to purchase some amount, you need some dollars to purchase goods that you require just to survive. All right, you don't need polar bears. Without polar bears, you can survive pretty well. In fact, the budget line is horizontal at point M because people do not have to pay for bears. And three, polar bears enter the utility function only because people like more polar bears, or some people are afraid of polar bears, so it could be negative in that case. That is, polar bears in the one situation increase an individual's welfare or well-being or utility, and in another it reduces them. We were looking at grizzly bears, for example, in the parks. I've traveled quite a bit through Banff National Park, and there were people there who were actual wilderness campers and hikers, and they looked at grizzly bears as providing negative utility to them. But in any event, these are non-market goods. These environmental, ecological goods and services, or just knowing that polar bears exist or not, that's a non-market good. They don't affect the budget line, but they do affect your well-being. So in this case, if the number of bears, polar bears, increases from B1 to B2, some people would find that an increase in utility. So how do we measure this welfare change? Well, without prices for, now we're going to use G as a general good, an environmental good or service. We use compensating measures that we refer to as compensating surplus and equivalent surplus, because there are no price lines here. You don't see any prices here. You've got your budget constraint, which is this horizontal line. And in this case, you have to measure the CS and the ES, the compensating and equivalent surpluses, directly from the utility function. And the only way you can do that is somehow elicit information from individuals. So if an individual has the right to G0, but not the right to G1. That means they'd have to pay to increase the amount of the public good, if you like. The maximum willingness to pay that they would pay for a move to G1 would be given by CS, compensating surplus, which is this amount E1 minus B. So this is your compensating surplus here. If the individual has a right to G1, the compensation demanded for going back to G0, or your willingness to accept the payment to go back to G0, or to stay at G0 rather, is given by the equivalent surplus, which in this case is A minus E0. This is your equivalent surplus. So now what we want to do is we want to somehow estimate this function in economics where we have the environmental good or service on the horizontal axes and some kind of a shadow price, some kind of a price for that particular commodity, that particular public good. And we find that in going from G0 to G1, we want to estimate what this area is. All right, and it's a shaded area that is either the compensating surplus or equivalent surplus of the change depending on the property right regarding that utility level. And this is an example if you work it through the economic theory, and that's why economic theory in this case is so important, is that this enables you to identify an inverse compensated demand function. So how do we go about determining what the equivalent surplus or the compensating surplus is going to be? Well, we have to rely on direct elicitation. That is, we directly ask a number of respondents to a survey what their willingness to pay or the compensation they demand for a proposed contingency. We use what is called the contingent valuation method because it is a proposed contingency. The CVM, the contingent valuation method, is needed when changes in an amenity level leave no behavioral trail in markets. That is, the number of goods. So if we talk about polar bears, as the number of polar bears changes, there's no behavioral trail left that we can see in markets. There's no prices, in other words. This particular contingent valuation method was approved by the U.S. Department of Interior for implementing compensation under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, of 1980. And in 1990, the U.S. oil pollution law extended this liability to oil spills. It was upheld, CERCLA, that is, in the case of Ohio versus Department of Interior in the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. Values obtained from contingent value method procedures are an important feature of environmental economics, often used to justify action to address climate change, for example. The real question has been, how valid are such measures and why do they tend to be so large? Well, how do we, in order to determine whether or not such data are really of any use, we have to look a little bit as to how this method works. Well, there are two approaches that have generally been used. Now there are other ones as well. One is called the open-ended approach. In other words, we simply provide a respondent details about how many polar bears there are, what they do, etc., etc. And then in the end, we ask them what they're willing to pay for a particular program that would, say, expand the polar bears from some number, 1,000 to 10,000, or from 1,000 to something more realistic, 1,200. And the respondent would then provide a number which we would then enter into here. Okay, and then we can estimate a bid function where we obtain this dollar amount here, and we run a regression on as a function of the target level of the amenity, so 1,200 polar bears, or 200, the change in the amenity, 200 polar bears, the respondent's income, and then a vector of respondent characteristics. All right, for example, their age, their gender, their education, and so on. The more important technique, or the one that people like the most, is the dichotomous choice, or closed-ended method. They like this method because it represents what we do in the grocery store, for example. You stand in front of a particular item you're going to buy, and you make a choice. You either purchase the item and you pay the $10 or whatever the item costs, or you don't purchase the item, and as a result you basically save the $10. So the question that we ask in the survey, after providing all of the information about the contingency to be valued, is the following: would you be willing to pay Y dollars per year for this particular contingency? Yes or no. And all the person has to do is circle one of these or cross one of these, and this Y varies from one respondent to the next. That's the key here. So what we want to do when we use this random utility maximization model, we want to construct an experiment that enables us to determine the area under the compensated demand function that we saw in an earlier slide. So here we have two indifference curves, one U0 and the other one U1, and K is the original position and D is a proposed position. So in other words, what we're proposing is that the person's income, which is given by M and which is elicited in the survey, and we propose to that individual an amount Y, a bid amount, that they would have to pay in order to increase the environmental amenity, say the number of bears, from E0 to E1. So that's the bid amount, and they would accept the bid as long as the compensating surplus, so this area AD, which is the offer given by, which is the offer, or bid, Y, which is equal to Y, if compensating surplus is greater than the bid amount. So the offer is AD equals Y, and the compensating surplus is AC. All right, this amount here is your compensating surplus. AD is your bid amount Y, and as long as the compensating surplus AC is greater than the amount AD that is bid, you would accept the offer. You'd accept that bid amount. To illustrate how the random utility maximization model works, consider two individuals, X and Z. X has a difference curve that goes through K, the original point, and is denoted U sub X, and it's in red. Individual Z has an indifference curve that also goes through K, but is lower at point E1, UZ. So now each individual is asked if they would be willing to pay amount Y, the bid amount, to move from E0 to E1. Individual X will look at that and say, well, the amount I have to pay is AD, but it's less than, or pardon me, it's greater than the compensating surplus. So in other words, I'm going to lose. I'm going to go through a lower indifference curve. The indifference curve through D will be lower than the current red one. So their response will be, no, I will not agree to pay Y. Individual Z, on the other hand, whose indifference curve goes through K, but intersects this vertical line at E1 at C, says my compensating surplus is AC. In other words, the benefit I get from moving there is AC, but I only have to pay AD, so yes, I will agree to pay that amount. And what it would do is get them onto a higher indifference curve through point D. Now, using some fancy econometrics and some regression analysis, it's possible for an economist to estimate this distribution function for the random utility maximization model, as long as they have enough information on people's willingness to pay yes or no for varying amounts of Y that are being bid in these surveys. And you find that there are two measures. The mean willingness to pay is the area under the curve, over the entire curve. And sometimes you get into a problem because the function does not touch the horizontal line, which means that the area becomes infinite, and we often have to then put a limit on that, whereas the medium willingness to pay is simply given by where the probability is a half. And those two measures are then used as the value of the movement from good E0, from environmental amenity E0 to E1 in the previous slide. Now, there are variations of the contingent valuation method, and there are other methods. One of the most popular methods is choice experiments, which are now kind of the creme de la creme of methods for doing this. A choice experiment basically asks people to rate a bundle of goods that includes a certain level of the environment, but it also includes a monetary value in it, and another bundle will have a higher or lower level of the amount of money and a lower or higher level of the environmental goods, and the respondent then has to choose a number of these different bundles of goods, has to make a choice between them, and then the results are analyzed using various econometric methods. Conjoint analysis is another way, and some researchers have looked at fuzzy techniques as a way of looking at this problem as well.